My name is Phil Levine. I'm a professor in the economics department here. The talk that I'm going to be giving today is entitled Sex and Consequences, Abortion, Public Policy, and the Economics of Fertility. This is the cover of my book, which I've written and is going to be released any day now by Princeton University Press. So you can all go to Amazon. Thank you. You can all go to Amazon.com after the talk and pre-order it. I'd like to get started today by telling you something personal about myself. I hate going to cocktail parties. And there's really a couple of reasons for that. The first is that, as an economist, I'm kind of nerdy, and I'm a little bit more comfortable sitting in front of my computer than talking to a room full of people. But so that's the first reason. The second reason is a little bit more complicated than that. And that's because at some point during the course of the evening, and actually come to think of it, tomorrow night I'm going to a cocktail party, so I know it's going to happen tomorrow. So at some point during the course of the evening, I'm going to meet somebody that I've never met before, and they'll say, "What do you do?" And I'll say, "I'm an economist." Now, that always leads to sort of one of a potential series of questions. And so I'd like to do sort of like a David Letterman, like, the top three sort of thing. And so here's the first question that are most common economist questions. Let me see what else up here. The first one is, how will the economy do over the next 6 months? Okay. Then there's different variants of that question, but something like that. The second one, do you think the Fed is going to raise interest rates? And then the third, which is like the number one question, which really is sort of an offshoot of 1 and 2, because 1 and 2 is what the people really are trying to ask is, what's going to happen to the stock market? Is the stock market going to go up? Okay. Now, of course, if I knew the answers to any of those questions, I would be a very wealthy man and would not be offering advice like that at a cocktail party for free. But unfortunately, I don't know the answers to any of those sorts of questions. Actually, really, no economists know the answer to those kinds of questions. But I actually don't, because that's not even remotely related to my area of expertise. So this is really where we get to the trouble spot, because you're in the conversation. They want to know whether or not they're going to be making money in the stock market. I'm telling them that I don't really know the answers to those kinds of questions because I don't study that, which leads to the next logical question. Well, what do you do? Okay, and then I say, I study abortion policy. Okay, which leads to the obvious follow-up question, what does abortion policy have to do with economics? It's not an obvious relationship. And now the reason why this is so uncomfortable at the cocktail party is because I have, 20 seconds to answer that question before the person totally loses interest and they start looking around the room, seeing if there's anybody more interesting to talk to than me, which probably wouldn't be all that difficult. That's really why I was so glad to be able to come and talk to you guys today, because you're a captive audience, and I can actually answer that question, and I have, roughly 45 minutes to do it, so I can provide you with a good answer. So really, that's what my talk is going to, the overview of this talk is, what does economics have to do with abortion policy? I want to start out by thinking a little bit about why it might be useful to bring a fresh perspective to the discussion about abortion. There's obviously a very well-known standard debate about this issue, and I don't really mean to overly simplify the arguments, but in the minute or so that I want to spend on this, there's the standard arguments of the pro-life versus the pro-choice sides of the debate, where people on the pro-life side are making arguments about the rights of the unborn, and people on the pro-choice side are making arguments mostly about women's rights to privacy. Like I said, I could spend a lot more time talking about these arguments, but for the most part, you know them all already. Pretty much everybody knows them all already. And it's even gotten to the point where really there's very little purpose for even having the discussion anymore, because the arguments are so well known. Pretty much what happens is people just say, which side they're on, and you're done. And so that even goes as far, in terms of public discussion about these sorts of issues. That's, particularly true. So if you look at the transcript from the 2000 presidential debate, there were 3 presidential debates, each lasting an hour and a half. And despite the fact that abortion is one of the most controversial issues, social policy issues in the country today, the two candidates spoke about the topic there was one interchange that lasted about a minute. Vice President Gore said, the main issue is whether or not the Roe v. Wade decision is going to be overturned. I support a woman's right to choose. My opponent does not. Governor Bush was a little bit more succinct. He said, I am pro-life. No big words there. Now, that was it. There was a little bit of back and forth about partial birth abortion, but the main question of should abortion, what should the status of abortion policy be in the country, that was it. Everybody was expected to fill in the entire rest of their beliefs about an incredibly important issue based on just those statements alone. That was the extent of the debate. Now, what's really interesting about that is, for the most part, these two ideological positions, I guess I don't really want to say extreme, these two ideological positions are ones that most people in the country really don't align themselves with. So if you took a public opinion poll and asked people, what do you think about abortion policy, when should abortion be legal, 18% say under no circumstances, which would sort of line up with the pro-life position. 24% under any circumstances, which would sort of line up with the pro-choice position. But most people, the majority of people, say it depends on the circumstances. Well, the thing about that is, if the circumstances matter that much, maybe it's not an ideological issue for most people. Maybe they're looking for something more. President Clinton at the 1996 Democratic National Convention offered a potential alternative view, where he said that abortion should not only be safe and legal, it should be rare. Okay. Now, what's interesting about that is now we've gone away from ideology. Okay, there's a little bit of ideology in there with the safe and legal thing, but really what the emphasis in the sentence is rare. Right? What he's talking about is behavior. Right? There's certain behaviors that he's looking for. He's not trying to line up with as much with certain ideological positions. What he really wants is for people to behave in a certain way. Okay? So this is the introduction of what I want to make the argument that this really is an issue that can be thought about as a behavioral issue. This gets even more important when you think about Supreme Court decisions about abortion. The 1992 decision in the Casey case was the last sort of major abortion policy decision. And in that decision, the court ruled that an abortion restriction cannot be imposed if it imposes an undue burden, quote unquote, on women. Well, that's a great thing for a Supreme Court justice to say, or for the court to say, but you probably want something with a little bit more meat on it. What does that mean? What's an undue burden? And in that particular case, they sort of said, well, this one meets it, this one doesn't meet it, this policy meets it, this policy doesn't meet it. But it would be nicer to have sort of an idea of what it is you're talking about by an undue burden. And I want to propose a potential interpretation of that is we can think about it's an undue burden if basically the burden depends upon the behavioral change that's induced upon a woman. So in particular, if a woman would be led to have a birth that she does not want to have, that would be an undue burden. Okay? So again, we're talking now about behavior and not about ideology. This really brings us to what I think really is the basic answer to the question, what does abortion policy have to do with economics? The contribution that economics can make is that really what economics is all about is talking about how people respond to changes in their incentives. Okay? Abortion policy clearly changes incentives. When you impose a restriction, that's imposing an incentive for somebody not to have an abortion, and vice versa. Right? So we're going to change incentives, and what we want to know is how do people respond to those changes. Okay? That's something that economics can tell us about. Economists model all the time how people respond to changes in incentives and ways in which their behavior might be modified. And what's nice about economics is not only do we provide theoretical predictions about how we expect people might behave, how they might respond, but we also spend a lot of time conducting empirical tests trying to see if people respond to the way we say they should. And if they do, then that's sort of telling you something meaningful. at that point, basically, once we sort of can understand how people respond to these sorts of incentives, that might change the way you think about how we should set appropriate policy. Right? In some sense, rather than basing our policy strictly on the ideology, you might think that we might want to set the policy based on the behavioral response. What's the behavioral response we're going after? Right? And then set policy according to that. Now, the main hypothesis that I'm going to present in this talk and in the book is one in which we can think of abortion as a form of insurance. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what I mean by that. It's not necessarily an obvious statement. And so I want to back off of abortion policy for a minute and think about how economists normally think about any type of insurance. So, car insurance or fire insurance or anything else. And in the particular example of car insurance, the main benefit of the availability of insurance is that if insurance is offered to you, it protects you from downside risk. Okay? So if you get into a car accident, if your car is stolen or something like that, the loss that you would otherwise incur, you're protected against. Okay? That's the key feature of insurance, is it protects you from downside risk. Economists also, though, talk about other features of insurance, and one in particular has to do with the way your behavior is modified if the insurance is offered to you. Okay? And in particular, if you have complete coverage, people worry that your behavior might change in a way that increases the likelihood of a loss. So with car insurance, if you have complete insurance, so that basically if you get into an accident, your car is going to be fully replaced at little or no cost to you, then people worry that you may drive more recklessly. You may be willing to drive your car or park your car into higher theft neighborhoods. And all of these sorts of behavioral changes that take place are ones that what's happening is because of your behavioral change, the loss becomes more likely to occur. Right? Your car is going to be more likely to be stolen if you park it in a high theft neighborhood. If you didn't have the insurance, you didn't park it there, it wouldn't be stolen, there would be no loss. Both of those are features of any form of insurance. You get protected from downside risk, and behavioral changes may take place that increase the likelihood of a loss. I can go through fire insurance, medical insurance. All of these forms of insurance have both of those features. Okay? I want to make the argument that abortion may offer similar sorts of properties. Certainly, it can protect you from downside risk. The downside risk, the availability of abortion protects you from the downside risk that you would have to give birth to a child that you otherwise wouldn't want. Okay? So that's the downside risk that you're being covered against there. So that's the first property. The second property is that the availability of that insurance may increase the likelihood of the loss. Well, in this case, the loss is an unwanted pregnancy that would lead to an abortion. So the argument that I want to make here is that if abortion is offered very freely or very easily, then it may lead to increases in pregnancies, which would then result in more abortions, not more births. Okay? Both of those are features of abortion availability. So mostly what I want to do in the rest of the talk today is describe what I mean by that a little bit more carefully. And so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the economic theory in sort of a broad overview to describe how an economic model might lead to those sorts of predictions. Then spend a little bit of time reviewing the evidence and describing why I think it supports the theory. And then we'll go from there and talk about the implications for policy. So let's talk about the theory. Now, the theory that I'm going to talk about now is really no different than any other economic theory about decision making. People make decisions on the basis of weighing costs and benefits. Okay, that's the way that economists model decisions. And I really just want to put this the issue of decisions about abortions and pregnancies and births in exactly the same context, thinking about weighing costs and benefits. Now, before I get to the specific application, I want to address a couple of preliminary issues that may be troubling you right from the outset. The first is that what are the costs of an abortion? Is it that we're just talking about a lot of times when people hear economists talk about costs, they're thinking about money, right? And, an abortion does cost some money. It actually is not all that expensive. It costs a few $100s. And then people start to get a little bit irritated by that because really the cost of an abortion is not just about the money, right? I mean, getting an abortion is a difficult thing. It, might be emotionally difficult for you. You may have to, cross through picketers and be harassed, maybe physically uncomfortable. And for a lot of different reasons, an abortion might be an unpleasant experience for you, beyond just the cost, beyond just the monetary cost. Okay? So the first thing that I want to discuss is that, I'm not trying to be that narrow-minded about this. And I think in general, economists never really mean to be as narrow-minded as they might otherwise come across. Rarely, when we talk about cost, do we only mean monetary cost. The cost is anything that's going to impose an unpleasantness for you. And so in this case, when I talk about the cost of an abortion, which I'm going to repeatedly from now on, I don't just mean the $300. Right? I mean anything in any way in which the abortion is unpleasant, that's a cost. Okay? The second issue that I want to address that sometimes gets people concerned is this issue of weighing costs and benefits in terms about making decisions about things like sexual activity and contraceptive use and whether or not to abort a pregnancy. I think people get concerned that what economists have in mind is that, before you decide whether or not to have sex with somebody, you pull out your spreadsheet and do some calculations and look at column B and see if it's bigger than column C, right, and then act accordingly. I will assure you that that is not what we mean. This is not something that really just flies right by us. We don't really, understand that that's not really how people make decisions. We know that that's not really how people make decisions. What we do think about is that what we're doing is providing mathematical models that act as if this is how people are making decisions. And that's a useful thing because then we can make predictions based on the model and think about whether or not those predictions actually match the way people will respond. Let me give you an example where I think it will be a little bit clearer how it is that, I think why this sort of modeling makes sense. Suppose that you were a physicist, okay, and you were trying to set up a model that would predict whether you would pass another car driving down the street. Okay, so you're in a two-lane highway. You're going one way. There's a car in front of you. There's a car coming at you. Right? Should you pass the car? This is a decision which you make routinely. You make the decision in about a half a second, and since you're here, you've always made it correctly. And in fact, most people really do make that decision correctly. Now, as a physicist, you would look at that problem and see a problem with very sophisticated issues of motion and speed and velocity and stuff that I don't really know so much about. But you could write down a mathematical equation that would predict whether or not you should pass that car. You can also then tweak that little model and say, well, suppose that you're going 60 miles an hour instead of 55 miles an hour. Are you now more likely to pass that car? Right? So, and you make that decision correctly every single time you do it. So despite the fact that the physicist has this complicated model about how people are making this decision, the physicist knows that that's not exactly what you're doing. It's just a way to represent, this model is representing how you might be acting if you were solving this problem. And the fact that you solve it correctly every time, we're just going to use that model to predict your behavior. That's exactly what I'm doing here. Okay? I'm going to set up this model knowing that that's not how people behave, but using it as a representation to make predictions. Okay? So, that said, what does the model look like? Now, it turns out that it's actually a lot more complicated than this, but I'll be easy on you and give you the simple version. A CA in this model is the cost of abortion, because the thing with PowerPoint slides is they always tell you not to write too much stuff on it. And so if I write cost of abortion, that takes up too much space. So CA takes up only this much space. So this is just for graphic design reasons. We want to compare the cost of abortion relative to the cost of a birth initially. And suppose that the cost of abortion is really expensive, okay? Not necessarily just monetarily. So, in a few minutes I'll talk about, well, suppose abortion was illegal, for example. Illegal abortion doesn't mean you can't get an abortion. It just means it's really expensive. So suppose the cost of abortion starts out very expensive, and it's so high, in fact, that it's higher than the cost of an unwanted birth, right? So this is not about people who want to give birth, because this is not relevant for them. So this is the cost of an unwanted birth for a woman, and she's weighing that against the cost of having an abortion. This is about individual decision making. If the cost of abortion is greater than the cost of giving birth, then you're going to choose to give birth, despite the fact that you would prefer not to. Okay? Now suppose that the cost of abortion then falls. And so it's very expensive, and it starts falling, continuously. Well, you can imagine that at some point, it's going to cross over the line. Right? And at that point where it crosses over the line, you're going to switch from giving birth to an unwanted child to aborting that pregnancy. Okay? So abortion costs are going to fall, you're going to cross over the line, and at some point you're going to choose not to give birth but to abort instead. Okay? So at that point you're going to get, what you'll see is that abortions are going to go up and births are going to go down. Okay? So the main implication of that finding is that there'll be sort of a substitution of abortions for births. But now what I want to think about is suppose that abortion costs continue to fall further. Okay? What's going to happen now? Well, the first thing to realize is there can't be any additional effect on births. You've already stopped having the unwanted births. So there can't be any further reduction in unwanted births. Well, what will happen then is potentially nothing, but potentially what might happen is that as abortion gets cheaper and cheaper, what might end up happening is it may be beneficial for women to now substitute abortion for other forms of contraception. Right? Other forms of contraception are not free either. They come with a cost. And at some point, the cost of the abortion is going to go below the cost of another form of contraception, and you'll choose abortion rather than contraception. Okay? So what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that more women will then become pregnant, and all of those additional pregnancies will result in additional abortions. There's not going to be any more effect on births. The unwanted births have already gone away. They've already stopped happening. Okay? So as abortion costs continue to fall, the implication is that pregnancies will change and abortions will change. For every additional pregnancy, you'll get an additional abortion, but there's going to be no additional effect on births. Okay?
Are you amortizing the cost of abortion over, say, a year versus taking the pill or condoms? I mean, how could it be cheaper than abortion? Birth control.
How can birth control be cheaper
more expensive than abortion?
We're not just talking monetary.
It's not just monetary. It's in all issues. You got to, suppose, you're a teenager and you have to, it's maybe you're worried about talking to your parents about contraception, or you're a doctor about contraception, or it's uncomfortable for you to go into the drugstore, or whatever. Like there's cost to everything, right? Not just monetary.
You're weighing immediacy.
You're talking about social, emotional costs.
All forms of costs. It's the same thing with contraception as it is with abortion. Everything comes with a cost, not just monetary. Okay? So where am I? So those are basically, those are the theoretical predictions of the model. Now, what does that have to do with real life? Because we have this abstract issue of the cost of abortion that starts out really high and falls throughout. Right? Well, what does that have to do with the real world? We don't really get to measure it. There's no CA. Right? Remember, the $300 is not that. Well, I'm going to make some predictions, which are, at this point, sort of heroic in some sense, in terms of mapping out this CA thing, this abstract cost of abortion, into real-world policies. And then at this point, basically, you have no reason to believe that what I'm saying is true. But what we want to go do is look and see whether the evidence supports these predictions, and then that will sort of make you a little bit more comfortable with what I'm doing. Okay? I want to talk I want to think about the legalization of abortion as being the change in policy that switches it from being really expensive, which I think is unambiguous. If abortion is illegal, it's very expensive. That if you legalize it, for many women at least, it's going to cross the threshold of the cost of an unwanted birth, and at that point, basically, that's going to lead women to switch from unwanted childbearing to aborting a pregnancy. Okay, so abortion legalization will have that sort of that first effect, right? But once we get into a world in which abortion is generally available, the sorts of restrictions that we kind of, experiment with now, parental consent laws, Medicaid funding restrictions, mandatory waiting periods, those sorts of, in the grand scheme of things, relatively minor changes in abortion availability, that those sorts of policy changes are sort of at the bottom end of that spectrum. So relaxing one of those restrictions would be the equivalent of making abortion cheaper even after it's below the line, and that all you're doing at that point is substituting abortion for contraception. Okay, it has no birth effects. Now, in reality, in the world now, we're rarely, if ever, relaxing those restrictions. We're imposing them, right? So it's just going backwards, right? So basically, what it is I'd be predicting about imposing one of those restrictions is that if you impose that sort of a restriction, what you'd be getting would be fewer abortions and fewer pregnancies, and again, no change in births. Okay? So those are the predictions we want to make about how women actually respond to changes in real-world abortion policies. Okay? Now, really the bulk of the book, I'd say, is sort of devoted to this question of providing empirical evidence. Do people respond in the way that I just got through describing? Okay? And, I really present what I think is a lot of evidence that supports that view. And, in fact, it would take me much too long to have to go through a lot of that evidence today. Really what I want to do today is sort of give you a flavor for the sorts of evidence that people have used, including myself, to make these arguments. And then, basically the rest of the evidence is similar in nature, but, with different policies in different places and that sort of thing. So I want to start out with thinking about the effect of abortion legalization. And the advantage that we have in evaluating the impact of abortion legalization is the experiments that took place, the quote-unquote experiments that took place in the early 1970s that led to the legalization of abortion nationwide. Everybody remembers Roe v. Wade in 1973, but what most people don't remember is that in 1970, a handful of states legalized abortion before the rest of the country. So New York, California, Alaska, Hawaii, and the state of Washington all legalized abortion before the Roe v. Wade decision in 1970. So in economics, that's something we can use that to set up something that we call a quasi-experiment, because basically you can think about control and treatment groups, or quasi-control and quasi-treatment groups, where basically the set of states that changes the policy is the treatment group, and the state that doesn't is the control group. And actually, for abortion legalization, there's two experiments. There's the 1970 experiment, where you have one set of treatment groups, and then 1973, when Roe v. Wade comes along, that treats the other states, whereas the 5 early legalizers become the control group. So I'm going to spend a second here describing what it is that we should be predicting when we see this policy change. And I get to use my fancy little laser pointer here for this. So basically, we have two sets of states in the country. States which I'm going to call repeal states, which were the early legalizers because they outright repealed abortion. They outright repealed the laws criminalizing abortion in 1970. And then the Roe states, which are the ones affected by the Roe v. Wade decision. And so you might expect there to be some long-standing difference in birth rates. So right now I'm looking at birth rates. You might expect to see some long-standing difference in birth rates between the two sets of states over time, and you might be coming along, and all of a sudden you get the repeal. Right? And my prediction was that repeal in those states should lower births in those states, but not elsewhere. And there's travel involved and stuff, but forget about that for now. So you should see a reduction in births in those sets of states relative to the other states. Okay? And then there will be some new differential in births that will continue for a while. And now Roe v. Wade comes along, and now everybody is subject to the same sets of policies. So any differential that emerged during that intervening period will go away, and should go right back to where things were before. And that will reflect the reduction in births in the Roe states that's just sort of, lagging behind the same reduction in births that happened elsewhere. Okay? So the difference should go, some constant difference, and then a discrete drop down, and then back, and then over. That's what the difference in birth rates should look like. Okay? And if you do that analysis, you get something which is, this is just the empirical version of exactly that picture. Right? And notice, by the way, that it's 1971 that's really crucial, because there's that whole 9-month thing, which is also not my department, so I don't really know so much about that. But so 1970 comes along when laws were legal, when abortion was legalized in those states. You should see the response in 71 through 73, and then you should see it bounce right back after that. And as far as empirical pictures of theoretical concepts go, this is about really as close as you can ever get, right? So there's your flat period in the front, the drop down in the middle, and then the flat period at the end. Okay, so that's looking a lot like what I'm predicting. Okay, and so we can estimate exactly the magnitude of that drop, and you can do it for different groups of people. So for all women, we see that births fell by 4.1%, but for some groups it was much larger than for other groups. So for teenagers, births fell by about 12%, older women 8%, older women being older women of the childbearing age. Non-white women, almost 12%. And then, it makes sense that there should be a bigger effect for unmarried women than married women. Okay? These are very significant changes in people's fertility behavior in response to a single change in the law. Right? So you get very strong support for the first proposition. Right? When abortion is legalized, you see a very dramatic decline in the number of unwanted births. And then I said, I waved my hands about the travel thing. If you incorporate travel, you actually get effects which are even bigger than that. Okay? So that's the first part of the question. So this is the issue of downside risk. Abortion does seem to protect people from downside risk. If abortion became criminalized again, there would be more fertility, more unwanted births, and right now women are protected against that. Okay? The second set of predictions, though, is about what happens once abortion is legalized and we manipulate these restrictions. Okay? And so I just want to talk about one particular restriction, Medicaid funding laws. Now, Medicaid funding, so Medicaid is health insurance for poor people, and when abortion was legalized in the early 70s, basically the Medicaid system covered abortion. And in the late 70s, people started fighting about it. There were Supreme Court cases, blah, blah, blah. By the time you get to 1981, the Supreme Court finally ruled that it was okay for states to enforce a Medicaid funding restriction if they wanted to. That the federal government could impose a Medicaid funding restriction, and that states could choose to pay for the procedure themselves if they wanted to. So instantaneously, in 1981, about half the states imposed funding bans, or chose not to fund abortion, which led to a funding ban on Medicaid-funded abortions in those states, and the other states picked up the tab themselves. Okay? So here's, again, we have this sort of quasi-experiment showing up, whereas the states that implemented the restriction are the treatment group. The states that didn't implement the restriction and continued funding abortion are the control group, and we can look for changes in women's behavior right around or just after 1981. Okay? So here's a picture of trends in abortion rates between what I'm calling treatment group states and control group states. So again, the treatment group states are the ones that implemented the restriction, and the control group states continued to fund abortion throughout. So in the control group states, really, you don't see anything. There's just some rate of abortion that's pretty flat, not a whole lot going on. The treatment group states, on the other hand, there's maybe a little bit of an upswing here, and then maybe there's a little bit of an upswing here too. But all of a sudden, you get to 1981, and there's a definite drop. Right? Abortions definitely became less common in treatment group states than they otherwise would have been. Okay? So we would conclude on the basis of evidence like this that abortions fell when these Medicaid funding restrictions were imposed. Okay? Now, we don't really have very good evidence on pregnancies because obviously it's a lot more difficult to measure pregnancies, but what we do have very good evidence on is births. Right? Now, so what we want to know then is why did these abortions, where did this decline in abortions, where did it come from? Did it result in more births, or did it just come through pregnancies? Well, if we look at births, we can figure that out, because if there's no effect on births, then it must have come through pregnancies. So here's the effect on births. So the control group states, maybe there's a slight upward increase, like no big deal. Now the treatment group states what we were just talking about, hypothesizing, was there an increase in births that resulted from the fewer abortions? Well, there's certainly no increase in births. If anything, there's a decrease in births, although it does sort of more look like there's some sort of longer-standing trend going on there. In particular, there's nothing going on around 1981. Right? So around 1981, there's just nothing going on. And so you would, I think a reasonable interpretation of this evidence is that there's no effect on births. Okay? Certainly no evidence of an increase in births. What we conclude from that then is that we see abortion, the restrictions are imposed, abortions went down, births did not respond by going up. The only way that that's humanly possible is if people got pregnant less. Okay? So that's also then consistent with the hypothesis that I'm proposing and this notion of abortion as insurance. And we can do that. I can do similar sorts of things for parental consent laws, mandatory delay laws, access to an abortion provider, what happens if the abortion provider in your community goes away. Right? That's an increase in the cost of abortion. Other experiments in Eastern Europe, there's several experiments with changes in abortion policy. The entire body of evidence looking at questions like this supports these predictions that when abortion is legalized, the primary impact of that policy change is that unwanted births are reduced. Okay. On the other hand, once you're in a legal abortion environment, changes in abortion policy in the form of sort of moderate restrictions really are operating mostly off of pregnancies. So if you make abortion access easier, pregnancies will go up. If you make it difficult, pregnancies will go down.
Do you determine which percentage of this is from married versus unmarried? In other words, maybe you have fewer pregnancies because unmarried people are not being careful about sex because the abortion is about. It would be interesting to see how that would affect married people versus unmarried.
There is a little bit. There is a little bit of evidence on that. You get into sort of data issues in terms of looking at marriage, but there is a little bit of evidence that's consistent with that. It should affect, just like I did with unmarried women for the legalization, it should be a bigger effect for unmarrieds than for marrieds.
So would you repeat the question after?
Okay, could you repeat the question? Was the effect bigger for unmarried women?
Unmarried, so pointing out is, decrease in pregnancies might not be a bad thing in this case. It might mean that unmarried people being more.
That's exactly, that's the prediction. Oh, the question basically is the response bigger for unmarried women than for married women? And the answer is yes.
We have the questions after your presentation and not.
Yeah, let me just, I got 5 more minutes or something. So basically that's the nature of the evidence. And in the book there's tons of plots that look a lot like this. And in the journal articles there's lots of complicated regression models that basically are doing things that look a lot like this. But really that's sort of the nature of the evidence is of this variety, using quasi-experimental evidence to try to see whether or not we see effects for the groups that we think and no effects for the groups where we don't think. Let me finish. Okay? So where does that leave us? Before I sort of talk about the policy implications, I want to make a couple distinctions that economists like to use in terms of jargon. We talk about a relationship between something called positive economics and normative economics, where positive economics talks about the way the world is, and normative economics talks about more sort of, the way the world should be. So sort of really sort of normative issues. In terms of positive economics, economists do a much better job, I'll have you know, of addressing issues of a positive nature than of a normative nature. So positive economics is just, in this instance, is about how do women respond when we change abortion policies. And I think that I've tried to do a pretty good job of explaining the way that I think women would respond, and that the evidence seems to support that. It seems like legalized abortion seems to reduce unwanted births. That's the protection from downside risk that insurance provides for women. On the other hand, it also seems that the evidence supports the behavioral responses that I talked about earlier, that abortion restrictions reduce abortions, but they reduce those abortions through reducing pregnancies. And that reduction in abortions does not seem to lead to any increase in unwanted births. So that's the positive question. Now, the normative one is a lot more complicated for obvious reasons. And to get into the normative one, the normative issue, I need to think a little bit about something which economists call public versus private costs. This is something that was alluded to earlier. Everything that I've been talking about so far is about a woman making an individual decision based on the costs that she faces, and in our economics terminology, those are private costs. Anything that just affects you is a private cost. Public costs would incorporate the costs that the women themselves face, but also broader social costs. Okay, so any implications that there are to other people based on the decisions that a woman makes are incorporated in public costs, and the difference between a public and a private cost is something that we call an externality. So the externality is the thing that is imposed on somebody else. Okay, so if we think about a world with no externality, okay, if we think about a world in which it's only about private decision making, so that only women are affected, women themselves are affected by changes in abortion policy, then it turns out that the normative issue is very straightforward. Basically, abortion, there should be no restrictions on abortion. By imposing a restriction on abortion, all you're doing is increasing the cost to women themselves and providing no benefit for that. You're making the women worse off, and you're not gaining anything out of it. Right? It also means, by the way, that you shouldn't subsidize abortion procedures, because if the women themselves are facing the cost, then they should face it themselves. There's no reason for us to subsidize them. Okay? But if there's only private costs involved, then this is sort of a hands-off kind of approach. The government really should not be involved in regulating abortion. The issue comes into, when it gets a little bit complicated is when we allow for the presence of externalities. So what are the potential externalities associated with abortion access? Now, if we wanted to, we can now take this entire discussion and put it right back into the framework that I started off the talk with, thinking about pro-life versus pro-choice. If you want to think about the taking of a life, that abortion is the taking of a life, right? That's a huge externality, right? And if you think about the violation of women's rights, that's also a huge externality in the opposite direction, right? And so now where you are is you've got two huge externalities that are competing against each other. It's impossible to know what the right answer is. You're right back where you started from, okay? So the first thing I want to say is that we could put this debate right back in the context of the standard debate, and all we did was make fancy words for something that we already know the answer to, that you can't tell. So I'd like to abstract from that, and without diminishing the value of any of those arguments. Basically, I want to say those are fine, but I'm just going to leave those setting on the side for now. So that aside, what potential externalities could there be in terms of abortion? Well, first, there's medical costs, right? Because if you're putting to the extent that the medical care system is devoting resources towards providing abortions relative to providing other services, then there's an externality there. Abortions are not that medically difficult or expensive and devote very little resources away from other activities. Well, certainly you want to recognize that they might exist. They're certainly not that big, so I'm just going to ignore those. The next one I think is probably a little bit of a bigger deal, and that's the social costs associated with unwanted births. To the extent that a woman is forced to give birth to a child that she otherwise doesn't want, people have argued that that imposes costs on society through greater welfare expenditures, other sorts of social services, poor outcomes for the child. In many different dimensions, you can imagine that the result of an unwanted birth is an externality onto society more broadly. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. People have made those sorts of arguments in the past. So there's an externality associated with abortion that if we, say, legalized abortion and reduced those unwanted births, that would provide a positive externality because we would be reducing that cost to society. Okay? On the other hand, you might think that within a legal abortion environment, for example, you might get, to the extent that women use abortion as a form of contraception, there may be public perceptions that go against that. That maybe we don't, as a society, we don't like abortion being used as a form of contraception. Maybe not, and if not, then that's fine. But if we do, then that's a negative externality that we would need to incorporate into the calculus. So where does that leave us? So first, let's think about whether or not abortion should be legal. Well, legalizing abortion provides significant private benefits to women by preventing the birth of unwanted children. For the sake of argument, for the sake of time, I'm going to ignore that one. And it provides positive externalities. Right? If there's fewer unwanted births, that reduces cost to society. That also goes in the direction of arguing in favor of legal abortion. So within the context of economic decision-making, it seems like the question about whether or not abortion should be legal seems to go in the direction of yes, it should. And then, you could argue about the taking of an unwanted life, of an unborn life, and those sorts of things. You would have to introduce something like that to get out of this issue. Okay? Well, should we relax modest abortion restrictions? Again, if we relax those restrictions, we're still going to be providing private benefits to women. It's in their best interest to relax them. It's better for them. It makes abortion less costly. They get to save those costs. Okay? On the other hand, now the behavioral response to that policy change is abortion substituting that for pregnancies. Right? You get more pregnancies and more abortions, not a reduction in unwanted births. This is where abortion seems to be coming in as basically like a form of contraception, and this is where those public perceptions might come into play as a negative externality. Maybe we don't like that form of behavior. Right? If we do, that's a negative externality, and we'll work against this. If not, then you're done. Right? But what's interesting about this is the positive externality that we get in terms of legal abortion that says that society benefits by not having the additional unwanted births. That's just not true here. The evidence does not support that argument. So I think the conclusion from this is that this is a much more difficult call. Right? You could be much more easily persuaded that these restrictions should be allowed than you can in the case of abortion legalization. Now, basically, you're talking about offsetting benefits to women versus external costs to society. And then, how it is that we get to weigh those things are things that, we sort of really have no way to put exact numbers on. But now you have a trade-off, and now a decision needs to be made. What's interesting about this is that the positive externality, which works in the favor of legalizing abortion, isn't really working in this regard.
What do you mean by modest restriction?
I'm talking about, so the question is, what do I mean by modest restriction? In the whole range of restrictions that are available, including outlawing abortion, the sorts of restrictions like parental consent laws, mandatory delay laws, Medicaid funding restrictions, those are much smaller in magnitude. And so I don't mean to diminish the importance of them, but relative to the other thing, they're much more moderate in scope. So throughout the course of the book, I can't continually use the word relatively modest, or so I just have dropped that. So, yeah, that's what I mean. So that's the end of what I